Sarah Martinez had always believed that truth would prevail. Standing in the cold interrogation room at the federal courthouse in Virginia Beach, she could feel her world crashing down around her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Agent Thompson slammed a thick manila folder on the metal table between them. Inside were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be damning evidence that painted her as a traitor to her country. "Mrs. Martinez," Agent Thompson's voice was stern and unforgiving, "we have solid evidence that you've been selling classified military information to foreign operatives. Your husband's position as a Navy SEAL gave you access to sensitive data, and you exploited that access for personal gain." Sarah's hands trembled as she looked at the photographs. They showed her meeting with a man in a coffee shop, exchanging what looked like documents. But, she remembered that day differently. The man had approached her, claiming to be a journalist writing a story about military families. She had only shared publicly available information about the challenges spouses face when their partners are deployed. Nothing classified, nothing secret. "This is impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I would never betray my country or put my husband's unit in danger. Marcus is everything to me. Those men are like family." But Agent Thompson was unmoved. "The evidence speaks for itself. We have financial records showing unusual deposits into your account, encrypted communications from your personal devices, and witness testimony placing you at multiple suspicious meetings." As the agents continued their interrogation, Sarah's mind raced back to the events of the past few months. There had been strange occurrences she hadn't thought much of at the time. Her laptop had been acting unusually slow, and she'd noticed unfamiliar charges on her credit card that she'd assumed were errors. Someone had been systematically setting her up, but who and why remained a mystery. Marcus had been deployed with SEAL Team 7 for the past 8 months, conducting classified operations somewhere in the Middle East. Their communication had been limited to brief, monitored calls every few weeks. Sarah had been managing their household alone, working part-time at the local library while taking care of their 2 young children, Emma and Jake. The loneliness was overwhelming, but she had never even considered betraying her husband's trust or compromising national security. The interrogation continued for hours. Sarah's requests for a lawyer were ignored as the agents pressed harder, trying to break her down. They showed her more evidence, doctored emails that appeared to come from her account, surveillance footage that had been cleverly edited to make innocent activities look suspicious, and financial records that someone had clearly manipulated. "Your husband's team is about to embark on a highly sensitive mission," Agent Thompson revealed, his eyes cold and calculating. "The information you sold could cost American lives. How does that make you feel?" Sarah broke down in tears. The thought of Marcus and his teammates walking into danger because of something she was falsely accused of was unbearable. These men had families, children, dreams, and futures. The idea that she could be responsible for putting them at risk, even falsely, made her physically ill. But, as the hours passed, Sarah began to notice inconsistencies in the agent's story. They seemed to know details about her daily routine that weren't in any file. They mentioned conversations she'd had with her neighbor that no surveillance could have captured. Someone close to her was involved in this frame-up, someone who had been watching her, learning her habits, and using that information against her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't random. This was personal. Someone wanted to destroy her life, and they were willing to put American soldiers at risk to do it. But, why? What had she done to deserve such elaborate revenge? As night fell, Sarah was transferred to a holding cell. The concrete walls seemed to close in around her as she tried to process everything that had happened. Her children were staying with her mother, who had been told that Sarah was dealing with a family emergency. How long before the truth came out? How long before Emma and Jake learned that their mother was being accused of being a traitor? In the darkness of her cell, Sarah made a promise to herself. She would find out who was behind this frame-up, and she would clear her name. Not just for herself, but for Marcus, for his team, and for every military family who trusted that their loved ones were protected by people who truly cared about their safety. The next morning brought new developments. Sarah was informed that her case was being fast-tracked due to the urgent nature of the intelligence breach. She would be transferred to a maximum security facility while they prepared for trial. The evidence against her was circumstantial but compelling, and her lawyer, a overworked public defender, warned her that conviction was likely. But Sarah had noticed something during her interrogation that the agents had missed. In one of the photographs supposedly showing her meeting with foreign operatives, there was a reflection in a storefront window behind her. The reflection showed someone else taking the photograph, someone she recognized. It was Janet Morrison, her neighbor and supposed friend, the woman who had been helping her with the children while Marcus was deployed. Janet had been the perfect friend during Marcus's deployment. She had brought casseroles, offered to babysit, and had been a shoulder to cry on during the lonely nights. But now Sarah realized that Janet's helpfulness had been a cover. She had been gathering information, learning Sarah's routines, and positioning herself to destroy Sarah's life. The question was why? What did Janet have against her that would drive her to such elaborate revenge? And, more importantly, how was Sarah going to prove her innocence when she was locked in a cell with no resources and no one who believed her? As Sarah sat in her cell, she thought about Marcus somewhere overseas, completely unaware that his wife was being accused of treason. She thought about her children, confused and scared, wondering why their mother had suddenly disappeared. She thought about the Navy SEALs who might be walking into danger because someone wanted to frame her for crimes she didn't commit. The weight of injustice pressed down on her shoulders, but Sarah Martinez was stronger than her enemies realized. She had survived 8 deployments, raised 2 children largely on her own, and had built a life of integrity and service to her community. She would not let some twisted plan destroy everything she had worked for. In the coming days, Sarah would need to become her own detective, her own advocate, and her own salvation. Because if she couldn't prove her innocence, not only would she spend the rest of her life in prison for crimes she didn't commit, but Marcus and his team might pay the ultimate price for someone else's vendetta. The morning sun filtered through the small window of her cell, casting long shadows on the concrete floor. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember every detail of her interactions with Janet, every conversation, every moment that might provide a clue about her true motives. Somewhere in those memories was the key to her freedom and the safety of the men she considered family. Time was running out, and Sarah knew that once Marcus's team launched their mission, any evidence of the frame-up might be lost forever. She had to act quickly, but, from behind bars, her options were severely limited. However, Sarah had learned something important during her years as a military wife: sometimes the most dangerous battles are fought not on foreign soil, but right in your own backyard, against people you trusted most. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's arrest, and the walls of her maximum security cell had become her entire world. During this time, she had been denied bail due to the serious nature of the charges against her. The public defender assigned to her case, David Chen, was young and inexperienced, clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of the espionage charges. But Sarah had refused to give up hope. Using the limited phone privileges allowed to inmates, Sarah had managed to contact her sister Lisa, who lived in California. Lisa was a former investigative journalist who had left the profession to raise her own family, but she still had contacts in the media and law enforcement. When Sarah explained the situation, Lisa immediately recognized the signs of a sophisticated frame-up. "This isn't random, Sarah," Lisa said during one of their monitored calls. "Someone with significant resources and knowledge of how intelligence operations work is behind this. We need to figure out what Janet Morrison's real background is." Lisa began her own investigation from the outside. She discovered that Janet Morrison had moved to the neighborhood just 6 months before Marcus's current deployment began. Her background was surprisingly thin for someone who claimed to have lived in the area for years. The house she lived in was rented under a corporate lease, and her previous addresses seemed to lead to dead ends. Meanwhile, Sarah was using every moment in her cell to piece together the puzzle. She remembered conversations with Janet that seemed innocent at the time but now took on sinister meanings. Janet had always been particularly interested in Marcus's work, asking questions about his schedule, his team members, and his deployment timelines. She had claimed it was just friendly concern, but Sarah now realized that Janet had been gathering intelligence. The breakthrough came when Sarah remembered something specific. During one of their coffee conversations, Janet had mentioned having served in the military herself, specifically in intelligence. She had claimed to be medically discharged after an injury, but she had spoken about certain classified protocols with a knowledge that seemed too detailed for someone who had supposedly been out of the service for years. Sarah shared this information with Lisa, who began digging deeper into Janet Morrison's supposed military background. What she found was shocking. There was no record of a Janet Morrison serving in military intelligence with the background she had claimed. However, there was a record of a Janet Murphy who had been dishonorably discharged from the Navy 3 years earlier for attempting to sell classified information to foreign contacts. The pieces began falling into place. Janet Morrison was actually Janet Murphy, a disgraced former Navy intelligence officer who had been caught attempting to commit the very crimes Sarah was now accused of. She had somehow escaped prosecution on a technicality and had been seeking revenge against the military community that had rejected her. But Sarah's situation was becoming more desperate by the day. Marcus's team was scheduled to deploy on their sensitive mission in just 1 week. If the intelligence Janet had gathered through her frame-up of Sarah was passed to enemy forces, Marcus and his fellow SEALs could be walking into a trap. The thought of her husband and his teammates facing danger because of her false imprisonment consumed Sarah with urgency. Lisa had been working tirelessly to gather evidence of Janet's true identity, but the legal system moved slowly. David Chen, Sarah's public defender, was struggling to get the court's attention for what seemed like a routine espionage case. The evidence against Sarah appeared overwhelming to anyone who didn't know about Janet's involvement. Sarah knew she needed to take more direct action. During her conversations with other inmates, she had learned about the prison's communication systems and security protocols. One inmate, Maria Santos, was a former computer programmer who had been caught embezzling funds from her employer. Maria had been watching Sarah's case with interest and had offered to help. "I know you're innocent," Maria told Sarah during recreation time. "I can see it in your eyes. You have the same look my sister had when she was falsely accused of hit and run. The guilty ones, they have a different energy. You're just scared for your family." Maria explained that she had maintained contact with some of her former colleagues in the tech industry, people who specialized in digital forensics and cybersecurity. Through a complex network of communication that involved coded messages and letters to the outside, Maria was able to get word to these contacts about Sarah's situation. The tech experts began their own investigation into the digital evidence against Sarah. What they found was sophisticated but not perfect. The metadata on the supposed emails from Sarah's account showed signs of manipulation. The timestamps had been altered, and the routing information suggested that the messages had not originated from Sarah's devices but had been inserted into the email servers through a backdoor access. Someone with advanced technical skills and access to government databases had orchestrated this frame-up. This level of sophistication suggested that Janet Murphy had help, either from former contacts in the intelligence community or from foreign operatives who saw an opportunity to eliminate a loyal military family while gaining valuable intelligence. As the evidence of Sarah's innocence began to mount, time was running out. Marcus's team was now just days away from their deployment. Sarah had managed to get word to Lisa about the technical findings, and Lisa was working with a more experienced attorney who specialized in national security cases. But the wheels of justice moved slowly, and Sarah feared that her vindication would come too late to save her husband's life. The pressure was taking its toll on Sarah's mental health. She had been separated from her children for weeks, and the stress of knowing that Marcus was walking into potential danger was overwhelming. But she forced herself to stay strong, knowing that any sign of weakness would be used against her by those who wanted to see her convicted. During one of her conversations with David Chen, Sarah learned that the prosecution was planning to use her emotional state as evidence of guilt. They argued that her distress was proof of her knowledge of the harm her supposed treachery would cause. It was a cruel irony. Her love for her husband and concern for his safety was being twisted into evidence of her guilt. But Sarah had an idea. She asked David to request a meeting with Agent Thompson, the lead investigator on her case. She claimed to have additional information that might be relevant to preventing the intelligence breach they were so concerned about. It was a risky move, but Sarah hoped to buy more time for the truth to come out. During the meeting, Sarah carefully shared her suspicions about Janet Morrison without revealing how much she actually knew about the woman's true identity. She suggested that the agents investigate Janet's background more thoroughly, painting her concerns as those of a patriotic American who wanted to prevent real harm to national security. Agent Thompson was skeptical but agreed to look into Janet Morrison's background. What he found surprised him. Janet's story about her past had several inconsistencies, and, when agents went to her house for questioning, they discovered that she had suddenly moved out 3 days earlier, leaving no forwarding address. The sudden disappearance of the key witness who could corroborate parts of the case against Sarah was troubling for the prosecution. But it wasn't enough to drop the charges. The physical evidence, the doctored photos, the manipulated financial records, the fabricated communications, still existed, and, without proof of who had created these false pieces of evidence, Sarah remained the prime suspect. Sarah realized that she needed to force Janet Murphy out of hiding. Through Maria Santos and her network of contacts, Sarah began to spread word through underground channels that she had information about Janet's real identity and past crimes. It was a dangerous gamble. If Janet felt threatened enough, she might disappear permanently, taking with her any chance of proving Sarah's innocence. But Sarah was counting on Janet's arrogance and desire for revenge. Janet had spent months planning this elaborate frame-up. She wouldn't want to run before seeing Sarah convicted and Marcus's team compromised. Sarah hoped that Janet would make a mistake, would try to tie up loose ends, and would expose herself in the process. The cat-and-mouse game between Sarah and Janet was now in full swing, with Marcus's life hanging in the balance. Sarah knew that she had only days left before her husband's team would deploy into what might be a trap set by the very person who had destroyed Sarah's life. The next few days would determine whether Sarah could clear her name in time to save the lives of 301 Navy SEALs who trusted that their mission details were secure. From her prison cell, Sarah continued to coordinate the investigation into her own case, using every resource available to her and relying on the help of people who believed in her innocence. The truth was close, but whether it would surface in time to prevent tragedy remained uncertain. Sarah's love for her husband and her determination to protect his team had become her driving force, pushing her to fight harder than she had ever fought for anything in her life. The breakthrough came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, exactly 72 hours before Marcus's team was scheduled to deploy. Sarah had been awake in her cell, staring at the ceiling and running through every possible scenario when the night guard brought her an urgent message. Her sister Lisa had uncovered something that could change everything, but she needed Sarah's help to confirm a crucial detail. Through their coded communication system that Maria Santos had helped establish, Sarah learned that Lisa's investigation had led her to a former Navy intelligence analyst named Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah's lawyer, who had worked with Janet Murphy before her discharge. Robert had initially been reluctant to talk, but when he learned about the frame-up and the potential threat to an active SEAL team, his conscience compelled him to speak. Robert revealed that Janet Murphy had not acted alone in her original attempt to sell classified information. She had been part of a network of corrupt military personnel and foreign contacts. When she was caught, she had refused to give up her co-conspirators in exchange for a reduced sentence, choosing instead to accept discharge and maintain her silence. But her silence had come with a price. Her foreign contacts had cut ties with her, leaving her both unemployed and burning with resentment toward the military community that had rejected her. What made this information crucial was Robert's revelation that Janet had always been obsessed with SEAL operations. She had specifically tried to access SEAL team deployment schedules and mission parameters during her time in intelligence. Her current frame-up of Sarah wasn't just about revenge, it was about completing her original mission to compromise SEAL operations and sell that information to hostile forces. Lisa had also discovered that Janet Murphy had been using multiple identities over the past 3 years. Besides Janet Morrison, she had also operated as Jane Miller and Jennifer Moss in other military communities across the country. Each identity came with a carefully constructed background designed to gain the trust of military spouses who might have access to sensitive information. The pattern was always the same. Janet would move into a community where military families lived, establish herself as a helpful neighbor and friend, gather intelligence about deployment schedules and operational details, and then disappear before anyone became suspicious. Sarah had been her most ambitious target yet, the wife of a SEAL team leader whose access to information could potentially compromise an entire operation involving hundreds of elite soldiers. Sarah realized that Janet's sudden departure from the neighborhood wasn't a retreat, it was preparation for the final phase of her plan. With Sarah in prison and unable to defend herself, Janet could now safely pass the intelligence she had gathered to her foreign contacts without fear of being exposed. The frame-up wasn't just about destroying Sarah's life, it was about creating a smokescreen that would hide Janet's real crimes. But Sarah also realized that Janet had made a critical error. In her haste to disappear, she had left behind evidence of her true activities. Sarah remembered that Janet had always been particularly interested in Sarah's home computer and had often offered to help with household tasks that required computer access. Janet had claimed she was just being helpful, but Sarah now understood that she had been installing surveillance software and stealing information. Through Maria Santos's tech contacts, Sarah was able to get word to Lisa about the potential evidence on her home computer. Lisa, working with the new attorney specializing in national security cases, was able to convince a federal judge to issue a search warrant for Sarah's house. What they found on her computer confirmed their worst fears and best hopes. The computer contained sophisticated spyware that had been recording keystrokes, capturing screenshots, and copying files for months. The spyware had been installed with administrative privileges, suggesting that someone with physical access to the computer had set it up. More importantly, the spyware had been configured to send all captured information to an external server registered under one of Janet Murphy's false identities. This evidence proved that Sarah had been under surveillance and that someone else had access to any information that might have been compromised. But it also revealed the scope of Janet's intelligence gathering. She had captured not just information about Marcus's current deployment, but details about multiple SEAL operations, team member identities, and operational protocols. The federal investigators finally began to take Sarah's claim seriously. Agent Thompson, who had been so certain of Sarah's guilt, was now faced with evidence that suggested a much larger and more dangerous conspiracy. He authorized an immediate manhunt for Janet Murphy and began working to trace the foreign contacts who were likely expecting to receive the stolen intelligence. But Janet Murphy had learned from her previous mistakes. She had anticipated that her activities might eventually be discovered, and she had prepared multiple escape routes. By the time federal agents tracked down the server receiving the stolen information, they found that it had been wiped clean and abandoned. Janet had disappeared into a network of false identities and safe houses that she had been building for years. Sarah's vindication was bittersweet. While the evidence clearly proved her innocence, Janet Murphy remained at large with enough intelligence to compromise dozens of military operations. The threat to Marcus's team had not been eliminated, it had been confirmed and magnified. The legal system moved quickly once Sarah's innocence was established. All charges against her were dropped, and she was released from prison with a formal apology from the Department of Justice. But her freedom came with the knowledge that her husband and his teammates were still in mortal danger. Marcus's team was just 24 hours away from deployment when Sarah was finally able to contact him directly. The conversation was brief and monitored, but she was able to convey the essential information: their operational security had been compromised, and he needed to assume that hostile forces might be expecting them. Marcus's reaction was characteristic of his training and experience. He immediately understood the implications and began working with his commanding officers to modify their mission parameters. But, completely changing a complex operation on such short notice was extremely difficult, and some level of risk would remain no matter what adjustments they made. Sarah was released from prison to a world that had continued moving without her. Her children, Emma and Jake, had been staying with her mother, and they were confused and frightened by their mother's sudden return and the explanations of why she had been gone. Sarah struggled to find the right words to explain that she had been wrongly accused of being a bad person, but that everything was now okay. The reunion with her children was emotional and difficult. Emma, who was 8, kept asking why the police had taken her mother away if she hadn't done anything wrong. Jake, who was only 5, seemed afraid that his mother might disappear again without warning. Sarah realized that the trauma of the frame-up would affect her family for years to come, regardless of her legal vindication. Lisa had been staying at Sarah's house to help with the children, and she had been working around the clock to support Sarah's case. When Sarah returned home, she found that Lisa had documented everything about Janet Murphy's deception and had created a comprehensive file that law enforcement was using in their ongoing investigation. The house felt strange and violated to Sarah. Knowing that Janet had been inside, installing surveillance equipment and stealing information, made Sarah feel unsafe in her own home. Every room reminded her of conversations she had shared with the woman she had thought was a friend, conversations that had been recorded and analyzed as part of an elaborate plot against her family. But Sarah didn't have time to process her own trauma. Marcus's deployment was still moving forward, modified but not cancelled. The intelligence that Janet had stolen was still in the hands of unknown foreign contacts, and there was no way to know how much of that information might be used against Marcus's team. Sarah began working with federal investigators to try to anticipate how the stolen intelligence might be used. Her knowledge of Janet's interests and questions helped the authorities understand what specific information might have been compromised. This intelligence was immediately shared with military planners who were making last-minute adjustments to the mission. The irony was profound. Sarah, who had been falsely accused of betraying military secrets, was now working to protect those very secrets from the person who had actually stolen them. Her love for Marcus and her respect for his teammates drove her to provide every possible detail that might help keep them safe. As Marcus's departure time approached, Sarah realized that clearing her name had been only the beginning of her fight. Janet Murphy was still out there, still dangerous, and still in possession of information that could cost American lives. Sarah's battle for justice was far from over, it was just entering its most dangerous phase. The next 24 hours would determine whether Sarah's ordeal had been for nothing, or whether her determination to expose the truth would ultimately save the lives of the men she considered family. As she prepared to watch her husband deploy into danger, Sarah knew that her greatest challenge still lay ahead. The final confrontation came 18 hours before Marcus's team was scheduled to deploy, in a way that no one could have predicted. Sarah was at home, trying to comfort her children while monitoring the ongoing federal investigation, when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something compelled her to answer. "Hello, Sarah," came a familiar voice that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was Janet Murphy, calling from an unknown location with a confidence that suggested she felt completely safe from capture. "Janet," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Or should I call you by your real name?" Janet laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Very good, Sarah. You've been busy while you were locked up. I have to admit, I underestimated you. I thought you'd be too broken by prison to fight back effectively." Sarah signaled frantically to Lisa, who was in the kitchen, to contact the authorities and try to trace the call. But she knew she needed to keep Janet talking, both to gather information and to buy time for the trace to work. "Why?" Sarah asked. Why did you destroy my life? What did I ever do to you? You didn't do anything to me personally, Janet replied. But, you represent everything I hate about the military community. The blind loyalty, the unquestioning service, the willingness to sacrifice everything for a system that discards people like me when we become inconvenient. Janet's voice became bitter and angry as she continued. I gave 8 years of my life to Navy intelligence. I was good at my job, better than most of the men I worked with. But, when I tried to make some extra money by selling information that wasn't even that sensitive, they threw me away like garbage. No consideration for my service, no understanding of my financial situation, just a dishonorable discharge and a ruined career. Sarah felt a mixture of disgust and pity for the woman who had nearly destroyed her family. So you decided to frame innocent people? To put soldiers' lives at risk? I decided to show the world what your precious military community really is, Janet spat. Hypocrites who claim to value loyalty while destroying anyone who doesn't conform to their narrow definition of patriotism. You were perfect, Sarah, the devoted wife, the supportive military spouse, the woman everyone in the community looked up to. Destroying you would send a message that no one is safe from the corruption that exists in the system. But, as Janet talked, Sarah realized something important. The woman's voice carried an echo that suggested she was calling from a large, enclosed space. Combined with background noise that sounded like aircraft engines, Sarah suspected that Janet was at an airport or aircraft hangar. More importantly, Janet's tone suggested that she was planning something immediate. This wasn't just a gloating call from someone who had escaped justice. You haven't won, Sarah, Janet continued. Your husband's team is still walking into danger. I may not be able to destroy your life anymore, but I can still complete my original mission. The information I gathered is already on its way to people who will use it effectively. Sarah's heart sank as she realized what Janet was telling her. The stolen intelligence was being passed to hostile forces at that very moment, probably through a dead drop or encrypted communication that would be impossible to intercept. Marcus and his 301 fellow SEALs were still in mortal danger. But, then, Sarah heard something in the background of Janet's call that changed everything. It was an announcement over a public address system, partially garbled but clear enough for Sarah to make out, Flight 447 to Istanbul, now boarding at Gate C-12. The announcement was followed by similar announcements in what sounded like Turkish and Arabic. Sarah's mind raced. Istanbul was a major hub for international travel, particularly to regions where Marcus's team might be deploying. If Janet was at an airport preparing to travel to Turkey, she might be planning to personally deliver the stolen intelligence rather than trusting it to electronic transmission. This was both more dangerous and more promising. It meant the information hadn't been passed along yet, but it also meant Janet was about to disappear into international territory where U.S. law enforcement couldn't reach her. Lisa. Sarah called out, covering the phone's microphone. International departure, probably Dulles or BWI, flight to Istanbul, Gate C-12. Lisa was already on the phone with federal agents, and Sarah could hear her frantically relaying this information. But, Sarah knew that even if they could identify Janet's location, she might board her flight before authorities could reach her. Sarah made a desperate decision. She uncovered the phone and spoke directly to Janet. You're wrong about the military community. Yes, there are flaws, yes, there are people who make mistakes. But, the vast majority of us serve with honor and integrity. What you're doing now isn't justice, it's revenge against people who had nothing to do with your discharge. Spare me the lecture, Janet replied. Your husband and his team are going to pay for the military's sins. Consider it poetic justice. Then, you're no better than the foreign operatives you're working with, Sarah said, her voice rising with anger. You're betraying American soldiers to prove a point about military values? You've become exactly what you claim to hate, someone who puts their own interests above the lives of the people they're supposed to protect. There was silence on the line for several seconds. When Janet spoke again, her voice was less certain. You don't understand what it's like to be thrown away by the system you've dedicated your life to serving. You're right, I don't, Sarah admitted. But, I understand what it's like to have everything taken away from you for something you didn't do. The difference is that I'm fighting to protect people, not to hurt them. Sarah could hear announcement sounds in the background growing louder, suggesting that Janet was moving through the airport. Time was running out for the authorities to intercept her, and, once she left U.S. territory, she would be beyond reach. But, Sarah had one more card to play. Janet, I know you think you're getting revenge against the military, but, you're really just becoming a tool for foreign governments who want to harm America. Is that really what you want your legacy to be? Being remembered as a traitor who helped enemy forces kill American soldiers? The line was quiet for almost a minute. Sarah could hear Janet breathing and, background airport noise, but, no response. Finally, Janet spoke in a voice that sounded younger and, more uncertain than before. It's too late to change anything now. The plan is already in motion. It's not too late, Sarah insisted. You can still choose to do the right thing. You can still save those soldiers' lives. Whatever happened to you 3 years ago, this isn't the answer. Those men have families, children, people who love them just like I love Marcus. Sarah heard a new voice in the background, an airline employee announcing final boarding for Flight 447. Janet had reached her gate and was about to board her plane to disappear forever. I have to go, Janet said quietly. Wait, Sarah called out desperately. Please, just think about this. Those soldiers never hurt you. Their families never hurt you. Don't let your pain turn you into something you'll never be able to live with. The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, wondering if she had failed to save her husband's life in those final crucial moments. Lisa was still on the phone with federal agents, confirming that they had traced the call to BWI Airport and were rushing to intercept Janet at her gate. But, Sarah feared that they would arrive too late. 15 minutes later, Lisa received a call from Agent Thompson. Federal agents had reached Gate C-12 just as Flight 447 was closing its doors. Janet Murphy was not on the plane. She had been found in the airport bathroom, sitting in a stall with her head in her hands, surrounded by the scattered pieces of what appeared to be a sophisticated communication device. When agents approached her, Janet didn't resist. She looked up at Agent Thompson with tears in her eyes and said, I couldn't do it. I couldn't be responsible for killing people who never hurt me. She then provided authorities with detailed information about her foreign contacts and the intelligence-gathering network she had been part of. The information Janet provided allowed military planners to completely restructure Marcus's mission, eliminating the operational details that had been compromised and implementing new security protocols that would protect not just his team, but future operations as well. The foreign operatives who had been expecting to receive the stolen intelligence found themselves under surveillance instead, their own networks exposed and compromised. Marcus's team deployed successfully 48 hours later, with operational security intact and enemy forces caught off guard by the changes to their mission parameters. The operation was a complete success, achieving all strategic objectives without a single American casualty. Sarah received a call from Marcus 3 weeks later, the first time she had heard his voice since before her arrest. I heard about what happened, he said. I heard about how you saved us. I just told the truth, Sarah replied, tears flowing down her cheeks. You did more than that, Marcus said. You saved 301 lives by refusing to give up when everything seemed hopeless. You're the strongest person I know, and I'm proud to be your husband. Janet Murphy was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for espionage, conspiracy, and treason. She cooperated fully with authorities, helping them dismantle the foreign intelligence network she had been working with. During her sentencing hearing, she asked to speak directly to Sarah. I know I can never undo the harm I caused to your family, Janet said. But, I want you to know that your words at the airport saved me from becoming something truly evil. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I did. Sarah attended the hearing but did not speak to Janet directly. She had forgiven her, not for Janet's sake, but for her own peace of mind. Holding on to anger would only give Janet continued power over her life. The experience left Sarah and her family forever changed. Emma and Jake struggled for months with trust issues and fears about their mother's safety. Sarah herself underwent therapy to deal with the trauma of imprisonment and betrayal. But the family emerged stronger, with a deeper appreciation for the freedoms they had always taken for granted and a renewed commitment to supporting the military community they called home. Sarah received multiple commendations from military and civilian authorities for her role in preventing the intelligence breach and protecting American forces. But the recognition she valued most came from the wives and families of Marcus's SEAL team, who invited her to become an advocate for military families facing false accusations and legal challenges. 2 years later, Sarah established the Truth and Honor Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing legal and investigative support for military families wrongly accused of crimes. The Foundation's first major case involved helping an Air Force pilot's wife who had been falsely accused of domestic terrorism, a case that bore striking similarities to Sarah's own experience. Marcus completed his military career and joined Sarah's foundation as a security consultant, using his military experience to help protect families from the kind of sophisticated frame-ups they had survived. Together, they built a new life dedicated to ensuring that no family would have to endure what they had experienced. The wrong woman had been framed, but, in fighting to clear her name and save her husband's life, Sarah Martinez had discovered reserves of strength and determination she never knew she possessed. Her ordeal had transformed her from a quiet military spouse into a fierce advocate for justice, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come from the deepest struggles. The 301 Navy SEALs who deployed that day never knew how close they had come to walking into a trap. But they returned home safely to their families, protected by a woman who had refused to give up hope even when everything seemed lost. Sarah's story became a testament to the power of truth, the strength of love, and the importance of never surrendering in the face of injustice.